Today we speak with a former director of a local chapter of the Council on American-Islamic Relations about last week's terror attack in Manhattan, why he left that organization, and more. More on that coming up on Make Robots Not War. Stay tuned. Welcome to Make Robots Not War. My name is Jacob Santillan.
And I'm Annika O'Brien.
And thank you very much for joining us today. I know that what we're going to be talking about today is something of a touchy subject, especially in light of what happened on Sunday. And I do want to note, actually, that we reached out to our today's guest before both the Sutherland church shooting happened. So we do want to mention that. But for now, hopefully you'll find today's show enlightening. So let's get to it. On October 31st, a driver plowed a pickup truck down a crowded bike path along the Hudson River in Manhattan last Tuesday, on Halloween, killing 8 people and injuring 11 before being shot by a police officer in what officials are calling the deadliest terrorist attack in New York City since September 11, 2001. According to the New York Times, the attack ended when the motorist, later identified by police as 29-year-old Saifullah Saipov from Uzbekistan, smashed into a school bus, jumped out of his truck, and ran up and down the highway, waving a pellet gun and paintball gun, shouting Allahu Akbar, Arabic for God is great, before he was shot dead, or actually shot in the abdomen by a police officer. He actually remains in critical condition as of Tuesday evening. Investigators discovered handwritten notes in Arabic near the truck that indicated allegiance to the Islamic State. Investigators had not uncovered evidence of any direct or enabling ties between Mr. Saipov and ISIS, and were treating the episode as a case of an inspired attacker, according to counterterrorism officials. Again, we want to note that we'd reached out to today's guest before the Sutherland Springs shooting here in Texas on Sunday, which killed 26 people and injured dozens more. We'll get to that later into the show, but for now, we're speaking with the former executive director of the Council on American-Islamic Relations chapter in Columbus, Ohio, Babak Darvish. Babak, first of all, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm happy to be on and, speaking because, I think freedom of speech is a very important thing in this country, and everybody, no matter what side of politics they're on, or religion for that matter, need to have that freedom of speech.
Absolutely agreed, and we certainly appreciate you coming onto the show today. First of all, especially for the benefit of the listeners, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I came to this country in 1974, which is actually before the Iranian Revolution, which I'll go into that in a second. But coming here in 1974, we came to this country for my father's education. He was going to North Texas State University, actually, to get his PhD in sociology, and then later, he got his PhD in psychology as well. But during that time, that we came here, the whole purpose of his coming to the United States was for education. He didn't have intent of staying here originally. However, after the 1979 Islamist revolution in Iran, we were forced to basically stay here because, there's a lot of hostility towards, anybody that disagreed with the government. Now, as far as my family is concerned, in addition to not, totally being on board of the Islamist revolution, which was also a socialist or communist revolution at the same time, because those groups were allied together when they did the revolution and everything. They were very hostile to anybody that, represented any sort of wealth or authority or anything of that sort in that country. My family specifically, coming from an aristocratic background or nobility, was targeted, where they basically went to my grandfather at the time in 1979, and the revolutionary government did, and they asked him. They said, "Hey, what? We'll give you all the guns you need, all the weapons you need, as long as you enforce our will." He refused to enforce their will, so instead they put him in prison and tortured him instead. So it was kind of like that black and white thinking, where you're either with us or against us. So that was one of the reasons we ended up after 1979 becoming, permanent in this country as, you could say refugees or exiles. Um, but you can see where the change went from coming in as a like a student visa, like immigrant family type thing, into becoming like refugees or exiles. And the main reason why we became exiles was because of a combination of socialist, communist type mentality combined with Islamism. Because a lot of people don't know that. They think it's just like, especially in the Iranian case, it's just Islamism. But it's not just Islamism. It's a combination of cultural Marxism combined with Islamism, which is a very dangerous combination. And we can see this now in the United States as well.
We certainly want to get into that, but I also don't want to bury the lead. I know that there were some conversations about, Saipov from the other day screaming Allahu Akbar before he was, to make sure that I correct this. I said mistakenly that the cop shot him dead, but he was in critical condition or after that. But
he was healthy enough to ask for the ISIS flag in his hospital room.
Right, but I know that there's some kind of questions or controversy surrounding that particular phrase. Yeah. Could you kind of walk us through what exactly does it mean, and what have you seen as far as sort of the conversations with regard to what it does mean?
Well, that's a very good question because the term like Allahu Akbar is an Arabic term. It's not even Persian. I mean, Persians use it, but you don't. It's not native to the to the country or the language. But Allahu Akbar basically means God is great, or God is greatest, or God is the the greatest one. That it depends on how you translate it. But the concept is that like nothing else matters other than God, kind of thing. Now, some people use it the way that, like in the United States, like you hear people say Jesus Christ or Hallelujah or something of that sort. But at the same time, when it's in a, I guess you could say jihadist type fashion where if somebody's attacking you, in that case, the context is different. It's kind of like instead of saying like Hallelujah or Jesus Christ in the normal term, it would be kind of like saying Deus Vult or God wills it. So it becomes more of like a militant type, like battle cry is the term I would use. So the context is important, and that's one of the reasons. Even I myself, I was born into a Muslim family. I would consider myself more of a secular, moderate type, more spiritualist maybe, Sufi, on that level. But that said, if I say Allahu Akbar or my dad says it, usually it's kind of like, let's say if you're, you're sighing or you're kind of like, oh, instead of like saying, oh God, or, something like that, you'd say like, oh, Allahu Akbar, like, leave me alone, something like of that sort. But if it's in a term where like, somebody like this guy, was it the Uzbek Saipov, if he's coming at you yelling Allahu Akbar, you'd want to double check to see if this guy is just saying, I hurt my leg, Allahu Akbar, or oh, Allahu Akbar, I'm attacking you. That makes a difference. Yeah. I can see how that could be very touchy. I mean, I myself, if I was in the street and somebody yelled Allahu Akbar, depending on where I was at, I would probably react to it differently. If I was in a mosque or like some place that was like, like a Islamically related type enclosure or someplace where you'd expect it, then you were like, okay, well, not a big deal. But I guess out in public, you may sometimes say it, but at the same time, it's the tonnage. It's almost similar to the Japanese bonsai, in some ways, or like how like Americans, like soldiers when they go to war, they might yell Geronimo and jump out of a plane or something, right?
Yeah.
And it's kind of like that. It is a battle cry if used in that kind of fashion, but it doesn't mean that it's always going to be used in that fashion. Now, some people, I've seen some Muslims come out and say, oh, well, it's not a battle cry. It's, it's kind of like saying this, but it can be a battle cry, though. I mean, it's not. It can be used both ways. So it's not something where I would say that it's one way or the other. It can be. It's kind of like a double-edged type thing where it can be peaceful or it can be extremely hostile. It just depends on the context of it.
Now, you mentioned to us that you were the former executive director of CARE in Columbus, Ohio. What prompted you to leave that organization?
Um, I would say in many ways it was a mutual, I guess, departure, where I think my perspective of the situation versus theirs, as far as like, I think what they wanted and what I wanted probably was not 100% aligned, is the way to put it. Meaning that from my perspective, I had a lot of questions on certain people being invited for different kinds of, like, let's say, events and whatnot. From their perspective, they thought nothing of it. They thought, hey, this guy's just a regular, like Sunni, like, let's say, scholar or whatever. From my perspective, I saw it as something more than that, because, as much as Muslims try to turn Islam into a monolith, well, not just Muslims, but a lot of people who are, I guess you could say, anti-Muslim as well, they try to do that too in a different way. But, Muslims are very, very not united, actually, in various different ways. There's different sects, different nationalities, different races, even like different gender issues. There's even organization in the United States called the MPV, which is, they're into the LGBTQ type category, I guess. But, so there's a wide range of different kind of like Muslim organizations, Muslim individuals, sects, races, all that kind of stuff. And it does make a difference, because I myself, I tend to like politically agree with a conservative view. I used to be actually the opposite back when I was younger, as I think that tends to be a very regular journey for a lot of people, where they start out kind of like, with the whole college thing, and, everybody's into the, leftist liberal view. But as they get older, they start seeing things in real life.
As they start paying taxes and realizing life has consequences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So as you progress through life, you see that, all these kind of like, utopian fantasy type stuff in real life, it's actually completely the opposite. So, I went from that kind of view. And during the time that I worked for CARE, I was kind of still in that mindset in some ways, where I was like, I didn't even know about some of the background of the issues that CARE even had with, like, for example, becoming an unindicted co-conspirator or something like that, with the FBI, where the relationship that the FBI had with CARE was split, because they were like a unindicted co-conspirator in the Holy Land Foundation case trial or whatever. So that in itself is something. When I first signed up, I didn't know that was like. Apparently I hadn't been watching the news enough or something. But
hey, real quick, for those who may not know what exactly you're talking about, walk us real quick through the whole unindicted co-conspirator with the Holy Land Foundation thing.
Oh, okay. Here, one second. Let me pull that up myself, because
I'm looking up, just so you know, I'm on my tablet. I'm looking up some of the things you're mentioning, and then later I will post some links in the description. So if anybody is driving or whatever, they can click links to some of the references you've made, like the MVP, the Muslims for Progressive Values. So if they want to read up on some of this a little more.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, the whole case trial that went through, initially, and the reason why I actually woke up to that whole thing was because, I'm a big fan of, anything that has to do with law enforcement, or any of our agencies that protect the country, military, police, whatever it is. And one of the reasons why, when I was the executive director there, and this kind of, at the time was very, you could say, aggravating from my perspective, was that, I didn't know that this relationship had been cut. I had no idea that this stuff had gone on until, like, it came to the point where I wanted to make those connections and be able to, go, have those connections, like, for the organization here locally for our chapter. But once I found that out, it actually did that's where you could say my journey began into conservatism, because from that point forward, I felt that, I have a huge rift with how, the organization thinks versus, like, I guess you could say the rest of the country thinks. And I grew up in this country, so from my perspective, the American perspective comes first. I don't really care about all the stuff on the outside, because no matter what happens in different countries, my life here in this country with my family, with my friends, that takes a primary role. But regarding the unindicted co-conspirator situation, that's something that did come up, and I felt that's something that has been a continual problem with that organization since apparently it took place. And just to give you some, I guess, background on it, I think this was I'm trying to think what year this happened. Can't remember the exact year on this. I have to do some backtrack on that. But basically, there was a trial going on for the Holy Land Foundation in regards to terror financing, all right? And in that process of, where they were investigating the Holy Land Foundation, they found out that CARE had some sort of connections in there, either from individual members or something like that. And, they came up as an unindicted co-conspirator. Now, the idea there, obviously, I'm not, if that's something that's true, that's another reason why I wouldn't support that organization. And that's one of the reasons why after leaving, I have not been a fan of CARE, to be honest with you, is because having those it's kind of like the idea of it may or may not be true, but the fact that even the concept exists in itself is a problem.
You want to distance yourself from people where those allegations have been made.
Correct. And instead there's other, and as much as CARE tries to make itself out to be the biggest, organization in the United States, it really isn't.
Yeah.
There's quite a few other, Muslim organizations here that, I would much rather deal with. The one that currently, I've been sitting on their advisory board for the last, I think, couple of years, is a newer organization called MALA, or the Muslim American Leadership Association. That's actually an organization that's, I think, more in line with, my kind of thinking, because it doesn't just include, practicing or even fundamentalist specific Muslims, because I think one of the problems that I see with CARE too is a lot of the focus is on more of a fundamentalist or super practicing part of the community versus, the rest of the community, which may not always be practicing or may not be, fundamentalist and whatnot, or maybe even secular, even ex-Muslim. With Mala, one of the advantages I've seen is that, you have this thing where anybody from any background, be it let's say if you were born into a Muslim family and then you became an ex-Muslim, let's say you're a Christian now, you would be able to take part in Mala, because it's something that you don't have to be a practicing Muslim or a Muslim even to, take part in that organization, really. So it's kind of open to everybody. So you can be a Muslim, you can be an ex-Muslim, it doesn't matter. Those are kind of, some of the things that I think that have kind of pushed me in the conservative direction, is because, I don't agree with that, the whole idea of, focusing on all this, foreign stuff, per se, because, that's another thing. You look at almost any Muslim organization, the way that you can kind of do the litmus test of which direction they're headed is to see how much they focus on outside politics, like foreign politics, versus, local domestic. Because, if the Muslim organization is strictly, all they care about is Palestine, then know that's probably not one you want to go after. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with, Palestinians, but,
right.
The idea is that, once you, focus on this very political, foreign perspective, and that's all you care about, then you forget about what's going on in the country. Instead of us, for example, today, it's Veterans Day, you should honor the veterans. It's Veterans Day. I have friends here who are both Christian, Muslim, Jewish. They've served in the military. One of them, in fact, is a ex-Marine who comes from an Afghan background. He was one of the first Marines that put the flag down in Kabul after the United States, went in. So there are people like that, who have served this country, who are Muslims, who are not fanatics. But part of the problem is that people, especially what's happened, this whole regressive leftist mentality has created a situation that people like myself or my other friend or any of these people who are, you can say moderate to secular Muslims living in this country, who are part of this country, have become marginalized by combination of the regressive left and the Islamists together.
Yeah.
So it's not helping us; it's actually harming us quite a bit.
It reminds me very much of how any other. I mean, I don't want to say that it's just like the Catholic Church with the priests, because there's very little parallel there except for the protection aspect, where people who know something within a power structure come forward and they're shut down by others, and because they want, like, other people within the church that knew something was going on, they want to see the church survive for the greater good. So they would prefer to look the other way when things were happening, even if it was happening within their own families. And I think that's one thing that I notice a lot of leftists aren't affected by this firsthand. So it's always somebody else's problem. So here in America, I think a lot of leftists don't want to have these conversations. Imam Tawhidi, who is somebody, I'll post a link to his Twitter handle as well in the description box. He's for Muslim reform. And a lot of people say, well, why is he still a Muslim? That's kind of like saying, well, why are you a Christian if you're not against gays? That's kind of how I view it. Is you can be a Christian and still be open to other things. You can still have your faith in a religion. And a lot of religions have gone through, I guess, the Enlightenment period or some Reformation process.
Christianity at least has a Reformation.
Yes. And so when it's really stupid when celebrities take to Twitter and quote the Old Testament and say, well, why don't you do X, Y, Z? It's like, well, because that's not even part of the religion anymore. Well, you're not allowed to wear fur and leather at the same time. It's like, yeah, that was Old Testament. That doesn't. You can't argue with somebody who knows their book better than you. I know it's a very ignorant argument to have with a Christian, to say, like, well, if you're Christian, why are you okay with, gays getting married? Because many, many, many Christians now are okay with things like that. And I think that Islam, especially, like you mentioned the word secular, and that's the word I tend to use when talking about, like, Americanized or Westernized Muslims, that similar to you, and ones that don't adhere strictly to the the things that we fear in Islam, I guess, which are the kind of us versus them, which there are a lot of things that I've read about Islam that are very terrifying to somebody who's not a Muslim. And I think that you can have a religion like Islam in America as long as it's tolerant of other people, and that's the only way that we're all going to survive together. Does that make sense? I hope I'm not rambling on. Which is why I think, because when I read a lot of the texts from, like, even just excerpts from the Quran, it appears from my perspective that Islam does not allow other religions, and it does not lend itself to its I don't want to call them members, but the believers, the followers of Muhammad, to interact with those outside the faith in a pleasant way.
No, that totally makes sense.
Okay.
In fact, those are the same parts that I have problems with.
Okay. I'm glad we're on the same page.
No, we're totally on the same page. In fact, I've systematically been, called names and even threatened the same way Imam Tawhidi's, like, because both from the Sunni and Shiite community in Islam, because, those are two main sects, right? And then each one has a whole bunch of different subsects, and, they don't call it sects, they call it schools of thought, but, for the more practical purposes, they are different sects within the same religion. The same things they say to Imam Tawhidi, they say to me all the time. I've been called everything. And it's kind of funny, actually. Every time, when you as a Muslim resist, like, an Islamist ideology, the first thing that happens is Islamists will come after you and call you everything in the book that they can think of. And in their mind, there's nothing worse than being Jewish, right? So
I mean, I'm laughing because I think it's ridiculous, but yes,
No, it is ridiculous. And so the first thing that happens is, like, oh, you're Jewish, oh, you're working for CIA, oh, you're working for FBI, oh, you're,
apparently I'm a Russian bot because I don't agree with everyone on Twitter. So, we're all Nazis and we're all Russian spies.
Correct. Well, and that's what's funny about it. I get called names like that quite often. One of my favorites recently is Macedonian. like that's kind of a long word to use to, like, if you want to attack, why don't you just say Russian or something, that, or maybe, that might be a little bit easier than calling somebody Macedonian, Macedonian.
What is it about Macedonians that would be considered a slur?
I don't know. To be honest with you, Macedonia, like when I think of Macedonia, I think of like maybe Albania, maybe older, like Alexander the Great, the Greeks.
That's one that I seriously can't even pull a stereotype for. Yeah. Like, at least Turkey, I can think of like the little treats, the little candies, I'm trying to think of something else. Soccer. I'm trying to think of the Macedonia. I'm like, you got me on that one. I don't know.
Yeah, and so I don't see anything wrong with Macedonia. I mean, it's just another country, and in fact, it has a lot of like you can say Greek influence, because Alexander the Great was Macedonian. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind. But anyways, the whole idea here is that anytime a Muslim comes out and they tried to, push for any sort of reformation or critical thinking on anything in the religion, the first thing that happens internally is you'll get attacked by all sorts of different groups out there. Individuals, even organizations will come out. They say, oh, he's not a real Muslim. Oh, he was never a real Muslim. Oh, he's a Shiite. He was never a real Muslim. You'll hear this all the time. But the reality is that that's their way of trying to fight back against something that they can't control. Now, the dangerous part about this is that when they can't control it, they get more hostile, angry, and militant, similar to, like, for example, that stuff that happened to Charlie Hebdo in France, where, they came out with the Muhammad cartoons and somebody killed the guy, that kind of stuff right there, that's unacceptable. There is no justification. It doesn't matter how much you try to say, oh, I want to, honor this guy, honor that guy, God, prophet, or whatever. There is no excuses for that kind of behavior. But anyways, from my perspective, what I try to do is like, teach people about, different angles and different, I guess you could say, layers of, the culture and stuff. But Reformation takes a lot more than just, coming out and doing this interfaith work, because interfaith work in some ways becomes more disingenuous, I think, because, you come out, and I've seen this, CARE does this quite often, where, they'd go to like a church, a synagogue and all this, and they'd have all these meetings and different things. But the reality of the matter is it's not solving the problems as much as it should, because all that does is it creates kind of like a leftist Islamist type coalition. It doesn't solve the problems.
I do want to talk about that, but continue,
yeah,
please.
That's definitely a rabbit hole I'm willing to trip into.
But can you finish what you're saying?
Well, yeah. So it doesn't solve the problems, because at the end of the day, once that, like, let's say meeting or that article or whatever that comes out of that meeting is gone, the problems are still there. Like, you still have these people who do, like, there is a segment of Muslims globally who do want to hurt Western civilization. They do want to hurt other Muslims, first of all, because they see us as traitors. If there is no way to fix the situation, you're going to see a huge backlash, not in a negative kind of like a militaristic way, but backlash in the sense that you're going to see a lot of Muslims themselves leave the religion. Already there have been mass amounts of Muslims who have been leaving the religion because of these problems. Because, like, you look at, for example, Syria and Iraq. They've been in continual oppression by Islamist groups for quite some time now. And the younger people, especially, they're either becoming Christians or they're becoming Zoroastrians. And Zoroastrianism is the ancient Persian religion that existed before both Islam and Christianity. But, there was one article I was reading a little while ago about Kurdistan, where the Kurds, almost like 100,000 Kurds in one day converted to Zoroastrianism, because, they're like, we don't want this violence anymore. It seems like, wherever the Islam stuff goes, it turns into violence eventually. Yeah.
Oh, no, you can finish that sentence. Sorry.
Yeah. And that's why I think the Reformation stuff is very, very important. Without a Reformation, you're going to see, people eventually leaving the religion, because, they're either going to leave or try to change it. And if they can't change it because they're going to get killed, then they're just going to leave it. But then again, that's another problem. you have like Muslims out there who are like fanatical fundamentalists, especially from the Wahhabist type groups, who will kill you for apostasy. So if you become a Christian or Zoroastrian, the first thing they want to do is kill you.
Yeah. So apostasy is just leaving Islam.
Correct. Yeah.
Is part of Islam, from what I understand, part of the teachings of Islam is that everyone is born a Muslim, right?
That's what. Yeah, I've actually read that, and I used to, actually be very hardcore believing into that. But at the same time, over the years, I myself don't agree with that 100%. Like meaning Muslim in the sense of being with God, because everything in the universe is created by God.
Okay.
That part I can see, but this idea of everybody's a born Muslim, and if they become something else, they become an apostate.
Okay.
That does not work for me.
That's how I've heard it explained.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I suppose that in light of that, I imagine you do have a fairly sympathetic view on ex-Muslims, specifically because of these issues.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I as weird as this is going to sound, I'm probably I tend to agree more with ex-Muslims than I do with most people that call themselves Muslims. I think part of it is because they've gone through the same problems, they've come to the similar conclusions, but they've taken what I call the jump, which I haven't, I guess, taken yet, which is it kind of reminds me of that, what is that movie with Nicolas Cage, where he's an angel and jumps off a building?
I know which one you're talking about.
I'm drawing a blank.
Oh, God.
It has Megan Ryan in it.
I know Leap of Faith or something. No.
City of Angels.
City of Angels. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a scene in that movie where he's an angel, but he has to take the fall in order to be with his loved one, which is his love interest, Megan Ryan in the movie, and he finally makes a jump. He becomes mortal. So in a lot of ways, for a lot of Muslims, when they leave Islam, it's like they kind of have to take that fall and get hurt almost in order to be free, to do what they want to do, kind of thing. In some ways, it's dangerous, especially because this is one thing leftists, they come out and they're like, oh, it's just like any other religion. Well, for normal Muslims or those who are like maybe secular, moderate, it may be, but there is a portion of Muslims who are not, secular or moderate. They're very, very fundamentalist. They're very literalist. So whatever you read in the Quran is literal, and they will follow exactly what it says. And not just the Quran. For a lot of people who are into the Hadith.
I was actually gonna bring that up at some point.
Yeah, the Hadith is actually even more, I would say, dangerous than interpreting the Quran.
I've actually read the Quran. Not to cut you off again, I've read the Quran cover to cover, and I've read through a lot of the other texts. I was a debate faith moderator for an online website, probably a decade ago now, and so I learned a lot about Islam through that. I will say that regardless of how I feel about Islam, is a very well-written book. A lot of the book felt like it was written like poetry, very similar to how. And I'm not, I'm not a big fan of the Bible, but like how Psalms was kind of written, kind of gave me like a similar, like how Psalms is a very easy read. I thought that the Quran was.
Yeah, I mean, there was a reason for that because both Jewish and Arabic prose and poetry and, like culture is actually very similar. They're, literally, brother or cousin groups. And because of that, there is again, that's one of the reasons why I think Reformation is very necessary, is to look at those texts and see what's the history, the context behind these things. And another part that needs to be looked into, and I think this is something that a lot of Muslims would get crazy about if if they heard you say anything like this, is to look at the Quran itself and be like, well, is this actually a part of the Quran or not? Because there's one of the things is that there's this belief that the Quran is or the Quran is perfect and it's never been changed and all this kind of stuff. Well, it may be true from the time it was written down, but it wasn't written down until something like, I think, a couple hundred years after the Prophet died. So there's a lot of changes that could have happened in the meantime, number one. Number two, I mean, the Arabic language itself was more of language where people memorized it and they didn't write it down until the Prophet's time, where his son-in-law Ali, which for Shiites is a big deal, he actually created one of the first grammar and lexicons for Arabic. So from that point forward, the Arabic language kind of took place and everything. It took more of like a official purpose and all that kind of stuff. But before the Quran, it really didn't. People weren't using it as much, and it wasn't a very written language per se. I mean, there was not as much like Arabic writing that you see until after the Islamic birth, I guess you could call it that. The other thing that should be mentioned too is a huge portion of Islamic culture, or anything that we see that a lot of Westerners might like let's say like the poetry of the Sufi Rumi, who was a Persian Sufi poet, or anything of that sort. A lot of that really has nothing to do with even Islam or Arabia itself. It's a product of like Persian civilization, or it's a product of like Greek Byzantine civilization. Because those are the backgrounds that those people came from, and they took their own heritage, their own cultures. It's kind of like if a Muslim comes to the United States and converts an American, and they become a Muslim. Well, that American has American culture still, right? So
definitely.
Yeah. So if they write like a book, it's going to be reflecting their American culture, not I guess it's not the religion per se. It's more because the culture that they come from.
Exactly.
So if you let's say if that let's say American convert Islamic scientist or something creates a new science, that doesn't it doesn't automatically turn it into Islamic science, because a lot of people come out, oh, that's Islamic medicine. Well, it's not really Islamic. It's people who are individuals who happen to be Muslims came up with these ideas, but that's not because they became they could have become Christian and came out with the same thing. It's just they're intelligent people, being able to understand something that others don't.
Yeah.
And I think that, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, not long ago, there was an article, I guess, some group decided that that the Vikings got all their influence from Islam, and in Sweden, and so some, I guess, Swedish scientists had to come back and say, no, they didn't.
No, I guess read that article. And that's funny that you should say that.
Because having been raised in Sweden, I was a little like, no, I didn't like that. They're like, no, actually, the Vikings were really inspired by Islam. It's like, you can't have everything.
Yeah, you can't have everything. And what's kind of ironic? I mean, there are actual cases where, for example, Vikings, their clothing, they have sewn in like Islamic, what is it, like Arabic type, like fabric.
Yeah, but it's also, oh, you mean the fabric or the runes?
Well, no, the fabric that they sew, like, basically what's happened, and this is my interpretation of it, is that, Vikings were raiders. So they,
yes.
They raided a lot of places.
Yes.
So a lot of the places they raided were Islamic controlled areas. So when they saw that, pieces of cloth they could use to turn into clothing, because they were probably sewing clothes together, they're like, hey, this is nice silky cloth, but they can't read the Arabic on it. They don't know it's like maybe Quranic writing or some sort of thing like that. So they just sew it.
Pretty.
Yeah, that looks good. I'm going to use it for some clothes. So, coming out 500 years later, 1,000 years later, and saying, they were like Muslim or they loved Islam and all that. No, it has nothing to do with that. It's just the fact they found this, and they turn it into clothing. That's basically what it is.
Either it was taken by force or it was given as a gift. We forget that not everybody's always an asshole. Or maybe it was purchased in trade. We don't know. I think historians probably have a better idea. But the original article I read was trying to make it sound like, and of course it was, Muslims were the ones who came out with it, that like somehow that it proves that Swedes got all their culture from Islam, which I thought was funny. Yeah, they probably learned how to hunt reindeer in the Quran.
Apparently, because
I'm being rude now.
No, but because that's one of the. It's funny that you say that, because so much of this kind of stuff goes back to this kind of fundamentalist type of thinking, that they believe that everything. Because here's what happens: is everybody, the very fundamentalists think that everything comes from God, which I might think that too, but at the same time, not in the same fashion that just because we believe everything comes from God doesn't mean that everything is Islamic.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
I agree. No, I
So,
agree.
yeah, so like if they have something nice or good at science or good, whatever it is, oh, that's because of Islam. No, it's not.
Yeah.
And in fact, if I had to, count the amount of things I love in my life that are, not created by Muslims, is probably a huge percentage. Everything,
Yeah.
including my laptop, my phone, my, German automobile, all that kind of stuff. It's not coming from Islam. It's coming from the Christian Western civilization is where it's coming from.
Or it's coming from people.
Yeah.
That's what, like,
people,
that's when I see these women who fight about the patriarchy and the straight white men and technology. Every time I log onto the internet, I don't think, oh, Tim Berners-Lee was a straight white male. Ooh, the patriarchy. Or I don't, every time I fire up my phone or my iPad, I don't think of the straight white patriarchy. I just think of people. Like, free markets gave me this stuff. You know what? Women raised those men. Women bore those men. Women were part of those men's lives. So if men developed every piece of electronic technology that we have on the planet from here on out, I wouldn't see it as a man's world. Women are still involved in society, and we don't have to get off on that topic too much, even though it does have Islam.
No, I agree. Well, and that's funny that you mentioned that because so much of the stuff that I see where they try to melt, Islamic stuff with leftist stuff together, it kind of makes me laugh because
the two are diametrically opposed.
Well, exactly, especially when it comes to fundamentalist Islam, which basically what the regressive left supports is not like Muslims like myself. It's actually more of the fundamentalist Muslims. So.
Yep.
They're not supporting the I guess the right part of it, so to speak. And in fact, who was it? I think it was like Linda Sarsour came out a while ago talking about Sharia law is great, and all that kind of stuff. Well,
yeah, she's all about Sharia law.
Yeah.
Because then what is it like? Yeah. Lowered or you don't have to pay interest on a loan. Like interest-free loans was her thing. It's like, wait,
something along those lines.
So you can set me on fire because I fell in, my parents can set me on fire, and that's totally cool. They can cut up my clitoris on the kitchen floor. But interest-free loans.
Yeah, well, and that's, I guess, the price you pay, apparently. But that's the thing. It's like, that kind of mentality, I consider that a form of cultish brainwashing, where, if you think Sharia law is perfect and it should rule the country and all that, that in itself is a contradictory type situation with the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah.
If you're an American and you live here, you got to abide by the U.S. Constitution. Period.
Well, Sarsour was born in America. She's actually an American. She claims. I mean, I have no reason not to believe this, that she was in a not arranged marriage. I don't know that whole history, but it's like something she's proud of. The other thing, to bring it back to our original story about the terrorist, the NYPD was monitoring the mosque, one of the mosques in New York. I think it was the mosque I'm pretty sure because they said the Seyfullah Saipov, the mosque that he allegedly, the one that he was attending at some point. And she convinced the NYPD to stop monitoring it back in, I want to say 2012. I need to research the date, but I am positive about the fact.
I heard that as well, actually. And I agree. These kind of things, should not be happening. I mean, if there is a problem, because again, this has nothing to do with racism. This has nothing to do with religious bigotry.
And since when has Islam been a race?
It's not. It's not a race. And that's what's another thing that the left has created is they've turned Islam into a race. Because I myself, being from an Iranian background, Iranians and actually Arabs, like Linda Sarsour, for example, we are not, the term, when they say people of color, we are not people of color. We are white Caucasians.
Yeah. Thank you for that. You said it, not me.
Yeah. Well, I'm being honest because
I know, but I've gotten in arguments with people that are people of color that are lighter than me, but they're not. Yeah. They're not people of color. They're just They're not Swedish or Irish, so therefore
Yeah,
they
the
win
only
the
time,
argument.
yeah, the only time we would be considered people of color is if you're specifically talking about white Caucasian Anglo-Saxons and not
Which I
white
am.
Caucasian Iranians.
Yeah, but I mean,
Yeah,
I'm also getting really sick and tired of the whole having to divide everybody up by their race and their genetics. I think it's
yeah,
getting exhausting. Like,
yeah,
I
which I
under
think is ridiculous because that's the funny thing is like if the left cares so much about race, like people not being racist, they're actually doing the opposite because they're dividing us amongst like racial lines. When I
yeah.
look at my best friend, he's if I wanted to be like a leftist, I would call him, okay, well, he's like a white German Catholic. All right. Um, and then I'm, let's see, white Iranian or ethnic Iranian Muslim. You know, those are that's the kind of division that the left is creating in this country, and it's actually not a positive thing. It's a very negative
Yeah.
thing.
Identity
Uh,
politics.
Let's do get
right.
into the whole strange, unholy alliance between leftists and Islamists. Just to get in a little bit myself, I'm an atheist myself. I've pretty much always been so. For as long as I can remember, I've criticized Christianity in ways that even at this point I regret. But one thing that kind of got me to leave the left was this double standard where if you criticize Christianity, you're stunning and brave. If you say a measly, mumbling word about Islam, criticizing it perhaps even for the same reasons you might criticize Christianity, all of a sudden, as Ben Affleck showed us, you're suddenly gross and racist. Tell us a little bit what you think about this weird alliance, this seemingly contradictory alliance between leftists and Islamists.
This alliance is not something new. It is new in the United States, like as far as like our situation currently is concerned, but it's not a new concept in general. Meaning that the Islamo-leftist or Islamist socialist or Islamist communist alliance has existed all the way back to the Cold War era. And in fact, the reason why the Iranian Revolution was able to take place was because of that alliance. If there was no communist or the Hezbollah Tudeh or the socialist Marxist called Mujahideen Khalq, or for the Iranian Hezbollah, the combination of this Islamist, communist, Marxist, socialist type groups, they all came together as an alliance and they overthrew the monarchy in Iran. Without all those parts in there, the Islamists by themselves were not going to be able to do that by themselves. But now here's the interesting part is that could have turned either way after the revolution. It could have become all communist or all socialist, but instead, because the Islamist groups were stronger at the time, they were able to actually start literally eliminating the outward, the outwardly communist or the outwardly socialists. They started executing them. Now, ironically, those who did not want to get executed soon put turbans on and started flipping prayer beads, and now are part of the government there. So even to this day, elements of both Islamist, socialist, Marxist, communist, all working together, even in the Iranian government to this very day.
So a quick historical question. Why did the Islamists descend upon the socialist, communist, Marxists and execute them after they overthrew the Shah?
For power and control.
Yeah, but I mean, what were the philosophical differences? I mean, what kind of? I mean, I understand that part, the realpolitik of.
Well, the philosophical differences actually goes back to Ayatollah Khomeini himself, because he came out and he said something to the effect that we are neither capitalists nor, no, this is what he said. He said we're neither like Christian or like Western capitalists, neither Eastern atheists or communists. So neither the left nor the right. So his view was that there's an Islamist middle ground, right? But one thing that it leaves out is the fact that in an Islamic government sense, like, if you have a government with Sharia law, part of the issue is that like an Islamic government by nature is partly capitalist and partly socialist. But mostly it focuses more on the socialist side because, this whole thing about like, the poor, the underprivileged, all that kind of stuff. But it focuses so much on the socialist side that that's where the you can say the common grounds exist between Islamists and the socialists or communists. The one part they agree on comes down to the socialist aspect of things. But outside of that, kind of how you said, like most communists, most Marxists, most socialists tend to be atheists. That being the case, that's a huge rift between an Islamist government versus a socialist or Marxist or communist government.
Yeah, so
it is. I will say, it is nice speaking with someone who can pronounce all these words correctly. Like I say, Hezbollah, which that's like so to hear you with all the.
That's funny. Yeah. Well, and Hezbollah, in comparison to some of the new organizations that are out today, it's kind of like the Mickey Mouse of groups out there. But still, yeah, they have power. The Iranian governments, they back them and everything. But ISIS itself is something that's kind of like the way I would compare it, and this may sound funny how the comparison I'm going to use, but if you guys are familiar with any of the Predator movies, Alien versus Predator, all that kind of stuff.
Very much.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, and this may kind of resonate more in this kind of comparison, kind of like a cultural reference. The difference between Hezbollah and ISIS is kind of like the Predators movie that came out more recently, where it had the regular Predators that we remember from the Arnold Schwarzenegger movies.
Right.
And then there's the Super Predator. Right? The Super Predator is ISIS. The regular Predator is Hezbollah.
Right. I think I know what.
So how Hillary Clinton would refer to as black teenagers, super predators.
I knew she was going to go right there. I don't know if you remember
predators.
when I guess a long time ago, one of the issues of the 2016 campaign was years ago. Hillary Clinton had called some black people super predators, and like a lot of folks got really mad about that. So I mean,
she has a rich history of racism. But she flipped a switch in 2013. She all of a sudden wanted gays to marry, and now she doesn't think black people are predators anymore. Anyway, I did want to kind of, I mean, wow, this is a lot. I thank you for like the different organizations that you've listed too. If there's anything that you can think of, like the Mala and then the Muslims for Progressive Values, if there's other organizations like this that you think of even afterwards. Let me know and I'll look into them. I do follow some ex-Muslims on Twitter. Ex-Muslim TV is one that I kind of started. I don't remember how it ended up in my feed.
Yeah, there's actually lately there's been a ton of ex-Muslims that are producing a lot of good work on YouTube, discussing different issues, like being critical on issues that do need change.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I like Imam Tawhidi, is because Imam Tawhidi is on the same page with that, meaning that he too, he's done interviews with ex-Muslims too, which is impressive because you won't see that normally. Most of them try to act like as if it doesn't exist. Oh, there's no such things as ex-Muslims, but the fact that, that ex-Muslims do exist in itself is something that in some ways shows that not all Muslims are violent, crazy people trying to kill apostates, but at the same time, there is also, that also does exist, but it shows that there's enough Muslims that are coming out now. In some ways, this is kind of sound kind of funny, but it's almost like so many Muslims who are ex-Muslims to begin with, but still call themselves Muslims, are coming out like of the closet, so to speak, and saying that they're ex-Muslims. And this is a new phenomenon in some ways because in the past, if this was to take place, their families would shun them. They may be hurt, beat up, executed, something of that sort. So for them to be able to even have the ability to do that is a very, very impressive thing. It shows the resilience of Western civilization.
Definitely.
And, how much people have that freedom to do that here, in the United States and in Europe and in Australia.
And
I think it's impossible to understate how important that is, namely because you'll have somebody who I'm a stone cold atheist, in having heard the usual criticisms from the usual type, saying that if you have any questions about Islam or criticize it, you're somehow a racist. Bottom line, I'd be more comfortable living next door to you or Imam Tawhidi than I would say like somebody who's as white as the driven snow, but is a hardened Salafist who's leading Sharia patrols through my neighborhood.
Oh yeah, it's ironic you say that. I had an experience when I was in Utah. because I used to live in Utah, and when I was there, I remember one time, and this was after a incident where there was like a journalist type gathering from like 16 different countries hosted by the University of Utah. We went there. Went to the conference. After the conference, me and my colleague that we were running the Muslim Forum of Utah, we headed down to a pizza place that apparently I think it was Muslim owned or had like the Muslims working there. So we go down there to get like a halal. And this is back when I used to eat halal, but like halal pepperoni pizza. And, as I'm ordering the pizza, one of the guys there is he's a white American, Anglo-Saxon convert who used to be, I think, either Mormon or Christian. And he asks about this kind of like an Islamic ring I'm wearing. And it's traditional, like amongst like Persians, they wear these kind of rings. And, because he was a Salafist convert, he looked at my ring and instantly considered me like somebody who's strayed from the path, or like a hypocrite, a munafiq, or like an infidel. And he literally said, brother. And here's the funny thing. This is something else I should mention. Converts, a lot of them, they think that they need to imitate everything about Arab culture. So they start picking up an Arabic accent.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah, so speaking in an Arabic accent, which to me was kind of ridiculous, he's a, brother, you must, not wear these rings, and I'm like, excuse me? Like, what are you talking about? What's wrong with the ring? The problem that he had was he considered like an idol, like I'm idol worshiping.
Wow. I mean, continue.
Within the Muslim community, people are not aware of. And this is something it's a very important part of why some Muslims are able to get along with Christians and why some can't. Because if you're a Salafist and you believe everything is idol worship, you're going to think that my ring is like an idol. You're going to think that Christians are idol worshipers. You're going to think, the whole idea there in itself, not saying that idol worship is good or bad. I'm just saying that from their perspective, they have a preset perspective of what you are and what you represent.
Yeah. And he was working in a shop.
Yeah, he was working in a pizza shop, but he was getting hostile with me because, we got in almost like in an argument because, he kept like pushing his view of like, that's wrong and that, you shouldn't be doing that kind of thing.
Sorry.
Yeah. But fortunately, my colleague that was there, stepped in and said, hey, I know this because apparently he knew him better than I did. So he told him, hey, you need to relax. This bro is like not like, he's not a bad guy just for wearing a ring, right? It's like, come on. So, but anyways, those are the kind of situations that you run into, and more, this can become a problem as you see people become, converted to the Salafism or mass immigration from areas where people are predominantly Salafist or fundamentalist.
Yeah. And then you have these white Western women who decide to convert for God only knows why. I guess they like the shawl, or they want the attention. Lindsay Lohan is one that I was thinking of just a moment ago when you mentioned how the guy in the pizza shop started speaking. She was giving an interview about how she's converted to Islam. This was in the last couple of years, and all of a sudden she couldn't speak fluent English anymore. She was like, "So I, my culture, let me," and now I sound like a Japanese anime character. But my point is, she was trying to mimic the way that the women in the Middle East speak with an accent when they come over here. And this is Lindsay Lohan. I mean, she was in The Parent Trap. She's a Disney child from America. And she all of a sudden was scrambling for English words, and she was forgetting every other word in English. How do you say in your language?
It's so weird.
It was ridiculous. I don't think she's a Muslim anymore. She was a Muslim for like a season, and then I guess it got too hot for the hijab.
Yeah, ironically, I've seen these series of videos that you're talking about. I myself, like when I saw this, I was like just flabbergasted of how fast they pick up this whole kind of mimicry, and it is kind of cultish, to be honest with you. Not to make another movie reference, but that kind of cultishness reminds me of Arnold Schwarzenegger's first Conan the Barbarian movie with Thulsa Doom, where people convert into this cult, kind of like a cultish type mentality. They start not talking from their own minds anymore. That's what I see. Every time I see those kind of things, that's what it reminds me of.
Well,
and it is, yeah.
When I moved to California, I had kind of a dopey Swedish and I went through an acting training, vocal training class on how to not sound like a retard. And I went through it 3 times. It was in Santa Monica, and I learned how to speak like a dumb California girl. And so it's funny because I did that like as soon as I moved there, and it took a couple of years for me to get rid of the accent. I still have it every time I get drunk or if I'm really tired. My husband, like when we go out drinking, he'll forget, and then a couple of beers in, he's like, "Whoa, shit, your Swedish just came out." So, but other than that, I think I sound like I was born and raised here. So
yeah,
I pull it off.
If you had never told me that you were raised in Sweden, I never would have guessed.
Yeah, well, but I have other Swedes you can find on YouTube. The same thing. PewDiePie is still in Sweden though, so yeah. He sounds dopey still.
Hey, I do want to get into. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. You were saying.
Yeah, I do want to get into something real quick. As I understand, do I understand correctly that you have a background in counterterrorism?
According to your Twitter bio.
That's correct. Well, the way I can describe that is that being in the community, you hear things that maybe not everybody else does, and not only that, but the concept here is that law enforcement itself needs help from people like myself in order to understand how to deal with situations quite often.
Yeah.
And that's something that one of the problems I see with that too is that it depends who those people are that are helping out, so to speak, because sometimes you might have people who may actually be Islamist or Islamist light type people who try to become like government liaisons or attaches, and that is actually a danger. It's kind of like similar to what you were describing about Linda Sarsour taking off the monitoring from a mosque who ended up being the same mosque that the Saipov guy came out of, right? So that kind of stuff right there, it's very touchy. Like you have to be able to, like when the government does this kind of stuff, or any sort of like local or state, federal government, they do this kind of stuff, they have to vet the people extremely well. Vetting, there's nothing racist about vetting.
Yeah.
There's nothing racist about profiling, in the right way, because you do need to profile. Profiling is something that's been used by law enforcement for literally hundreds of years, if not thousands. In fact, there's a story even that I think it's in the Bible, if I remember correctly, and maybe Old Testament, about a couple of Jewish warring tribes, where after the war was over, they wanted to make sure that the enemy wasn't getting through through this narrow river pass, and they would ask each person that came by how to say a specific word to see if that word is pronounced the same way or not, right? Well, the ones that didn't pronounce it right were killed. The ones that were pronouncing it right were led to pass. And the reason they killed the ones that couldn't pronounce it was because they were, from the enemy tribe that was trying to kill them.
Yeah.
So
I've heard about this. I don't remember which country, but they were saying right now, some article I was reading in the last few months, the Shia versus Sunni, that they can tell there's one question they can ask them, and it's something that seems pretty basic, and I'm grasping. I'll try to find the article, but to determine whether they're Sunni or Shia. I bring this up because I thought maybe you would be able to fill in the blanks. I'm sorry.
That's a good question. I'm not sure.
I'll try to find it. It seems like it was a pretty mainstream, New York Times or something. Maybe.
Gotcha. Well, I'm not sure if there's a specific question, but there could be different questions that you can ask.
Yeah, it was while they were in passing, they were traveling from one town to another, and the soldiers or insurgents, whatever you want to call them, would stop them and ask them a series of questions. They would have between 5 and 10 questions, and they would be able to determine based on how they answer. And then they would kill them on the spot if they answered incorrectly. And these were very basic questions.
Yeah, these are, and see, that's similar to the story that was in the Bible. But the whole concept there is that there's different cultural references within the different theologies where, like it's kind of like I would kind of compare it in some ways between, like, let's say a Catholic versus a Protestant. There's different ways that you view different things, right? And if you took those things and you use those things to ask questions with, that's basically what they're doing. Like, for example, with the Shiites, they venerate what in English would be called like some sort of saints, right? There's 12 imams, or they're like 12 saints or guides. Within Sunnism, there's no such thing, right?
Okay.
So and that's another thing too, naming mechanisms, the way that children are named are different between Sunni and Shia a lot of times, because you will probably never find Shiites who have names such as Khalif Omar, Khalif Abu Bakr, or Aisha. There's certain names that you will not see Shiites have because they're considered hostile to their theology, if you read the history behind it. So, and vice versa. Yeah.
Yeah. So I looked it up. I was correct that it's New York Times. However, the article that I just found was posted in June of 2014. So I think there was a more recent one that was probably a mirror of this, but it's questions rebels used to tell Sunni from Shiite. So, I mean, if anybody's interested, you could Google that. It's not that difficult. You'll find it immediately. They ask them like how they pray, what kind of music do you listen to? Those are just like two. So very basic question. Where do you live? What is your name? So like what you were just saying, there are certain names that...
Yeah, because like, for example, what you mentioned about praying, Shiites pray with their arms down to their sides, Sunnis pray with their arms folded in front of them.
Okay.
So that's a differentiation right there. In fact, when you go to a mosque, the first thing that you can tell if somebody's a Sunni or Shia is just from the way that they put their arms in prayer.
Okay.
All right. Well, I wanted to ask about your background in counterterrorism specifically because I wanted to go over this. I didn't want to gloss over it at the top of the show. The Sutherland Springs shooting, where this guy who, as I understand it, to get the facts, he killed, I think, 26 people, wounded, I think, an unfathomable amount more.
It is not a terrorist.
Well, yeah.
We're not. Yeah.
Right. I want to, when stuff like this happens, inevitably you see the chatter about, oh, well, when a white guy does it, it's not terrorism. When a Muslim does it, it is. I wanted to get your take on that particular meme is probably not the right word, but usual talking point. What's your take on it?
My take is that the Muslims who come out and say that are kind of being disingenuous, because if a Muslim does it, yeah, there could be a Muslim out there that has mental problems, or let's say they have some sort of a psychologically medical, like a medical condition. But at the same time, when somebody like, let's say, Saipov comes out and he does something and he yells Allah Akbar and he rams into people, killing them, that right there is terrorism because it's politically motivated because of what he the politics that he believes in. That's his politics. It's not done because he's pissed off at the person down the street or bullies that bullied him in school. That's not the reason he's doing this. He's doing it because he believes, as ISIS is teaching him, that in order to be a good Muslim from his point of view, is that you need to have a caliphate or establish a one world government ruled by a caliph, right? So from his perspective, he's doing what he's doing because of politics and religion combined. And that's one thing that it's a huge difference between him and somebody in Las Vegas who might have lost his mind. And now here's an interesting fact. If the Las Vegas shooter claimed ISIS and said, oh, I'm doing this for my political beliefs because I want to have a caliphate, yeah, he would be a terrorist 100%.
By
Yeah.
contrast, like the Las Vegas shooter, we still, I mean, weeks later, know next to nothing about this guy, and also the person who Kelly, his last name, who shot up the Sutherland Springs church. As far as he was a militant evangelical atheist, but apparently the reason why he shot up the church is because he so despised his in-laws, and that's where they went, that he just decided to commit this act of
he had a
unspeakable
long
evil.
history of violence. He also did not have a legal right to a weapon at the time that this happened.
I agree.
All of that
but
happened under Obama's administration, though. People are still
Correct.
blaming Trump that this guy had a gun.
correct. And that's another thing. Like
Things
the
weren't
guy
reported.
the guy in the Texas guy, he that right there kind of borders on both it's a combination of it sounds like he has mental problems, number one, but the reason why he did it is twofold, I think. One is the aspect of his mental condition, trying to harm his wife or ex-wife's family. The second part is, from what I've read about his history, and no offense to atheism or atheists, but it seems like he has his kind of like an atheist mentality to begin with, and the only reason why he was going to church was because of his wife's family. And whenever they made the split, it seems like he went to attack the church basically because of his own beliefs. So in some ways, it is a form of, like, you could say maybe atheist terrorism, but it's still more related maybe to his mental condition.
He had also abused his own wife and his own child, and he had broken out of a mental institution in 2012. So I mean, the guy was completely unhinged.
Correct.
He had nobody. I mean, and I've known a handful of people like that in my lifetime, even in the last 5 years. That I've even told my husband there are people that we know that I am no longer friends with. I will not be around these people, but they're the kind of people that if in the future I hear that this person shot up a store or a church, I will not be surprised in the least. And one of them is a militant atheist. He actually is very deeply involved in many, many atheist organizations here locally. And hopefully never, but if I ever hear that happened, because I told him to his face. In fact, that was one of the last conversations we ever had. Because he does own weapons, and he has pulled them on complete strangers in traffic. He's followed someone on 3 occasions that he's admitted to. He's followed someone to their home in a road rage situation and pulled a gun on them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so that's why he and I are not friends. Now he's an atheist. So.
Yeah, so in that case, again, that's it seems like a combination of mental issues combined.
He's definitely he's effing nuts.
But but at the end of the day, he's still not trying to establish a one world government called a caliphate.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Babak, before we do go, where can people find you online?
Actually, my blog, just my first name, last name.com. That's Babak Darvish, BABAKDARVISH.com.
Okay.
That's probably the easiest way.
Okay. Follow you on Twitter.
Or on Twitter, too.
Yeah, I'll post links in the description box, too. So.
Alrighty. Well, thank you
This was
again.
a sad day. We normally try to end on a happy note, but I guess the happy note is that you are for a positive reformation within the Muslim community, and we need more people like Jacob and I to support people like you. And
correct. One of the biggest challenges right now is to get away from this kind of regressive leftist, Islamist alliance, and if anything, try to find even a middle ground where people can come and discuss these problems in critical situations, use critical thinking and solve the problems instead of trying to just kind of because just going back on one thing I just recalled off the top of my head, the American flag hijabs.
Well, we can definitely get into that another time. We're just about up against it.
We are going to have you back on. 100%.
Yeah, absolutely 100%. But Babak,
hopefully it won't always be tied to a terrorist event.
So hopefully we can have something more upbeat to talk about. But Babak, thank you very much for sharing your time with us today.
Yeah, well, thank you, and again, I'm glad to be on here, and anytime you guys want me on, just let me know.
Absolutely, we'll definitely have you on again. So thank you very much, and take care.
All right, thanks a lot.
All right. Well, that should just about do it for us today. Thank you very much for sharing your time with us. My name is Jacob Santillan with
Annika O'Brien.
And where can they find us online? I'm
on Twitter, Annika Skywalker, and then the show's Twitter handle, which only has like 2 followers, me and Jacob, is Make Robots, just at Make Robots, and you can find us through that. So.
And you can go online and find us at makerobotsnotwar.com. You can find me as usual at my various social portals at digitalheretic.org. Thank you again for tuning in, and we hope you have a wonderful day.